On behalf of the University Lectures Committee, I would like to welcome each and every one of you here tonight for what I think will be a very interesting talk by a very distinguished political technician. The noted political columnist Raymond Moley has observed that politics is not something to avoid, nor to abolish, nor to destroy. It's a condition like the atmosphere that we breathe. It's something to live with, to influence if we wish, and to control if we can. We must master its ways, or we shall be mastered by those who do. And today in Washington, D.C., and in many of our nation's state capitals, there are many very capable senators and governors who sincerely believe, as do their supporters, that if they could only become the President of the United States, that they could promote programs which would lessen many of the problems that plague us as a people, and in general improve the quality of our life. If they're to become president, however, they must overcome two significant hurdles in their path. First, they need to get the nomination of their political party, and second, they need to win the general election. And in order to do this, one thing is certain: the candidate cannot possibly run his own campaign. He's simply too close to the situation, and he's too emotionally involved to make the necessary decisions that require a sense of detachment. And what our prospective president will need is the full-time help of political technicians, men and women skilled in the ins and outs of politics, people with knowledge about such matters as fundraising, research, scheduling, advertising and promotion, and various other matters which affect the voting behavior of the electorate. And tonight we are privileged to have with us a man who the famed political author Theodore H. White has referred to as being a technician of politics, one of the finest in America. In 1970, our speaker guided James Buckley's successful campaign for U.S. Senate seat in the state of New York. And in 1964, he was responsible in large measure for Senator Barry Goldwater's becoming the Republican presidential candidate in that year. And without further ado, it's a pleasure to introduce to you Mr. F. Clifton White, who will tell us how to win a presidential nomination. Mr. White.
Thank you very much. I suspect when I first arrived, I was looking over the audience, and I had anticipated that I might find a large number of Democrats present in the audience, like Muskie, McGovern, Humphrey, and so on, because there seemed to be a large contingent in that particular party who are interested in the factor of becoming a presidential nominee. But maybe the word didn't get back to Washington to let them know that I was going to discuss such a profound topic this evening, or to discuss it with precisely the title that has been assigned this evening, which is How to Win a Presidential Nomination. Of course, it could be a very simple answer to that, and it is a very simple answer, and everybody, if this were a classroom, could go home early. The way you win a presidential nomination is to get more votes in the nominating convention than anybody else. That is the fact, the ultimate fact of life in winning any nomination or in winning any election. That what you're dealing with and what you're concerned with here are delegates, and in terms of the general election, of course, votes. However, I do think there's been a great deal of discussion, talk, concern about presidential nominations and presidential politics, and therefore I would like to this evening spend a little bit of time trying to structure this process, suggesting some general rules that relate to the presidential nominating process in this country, perhaps ending up with a few comments on what the presidential nominating conventions of 1972 will look like, and then try to answer any questions that you might have. In terms of winning a presidential nomination, of course, as I suspect is true of almost anything else that we deal with that has an organism, a mechanism related to it, It's important that you understand the system. You know what the system is for the presidential nominating process. And that even becomes more fundamental in terms of American politics, in that you probably have to understand rather clearly what our governmental system and therefore what our political system is realistically predicated upon. And this is where we misinterpret a good deal of the presidential process in this country, because we have forgotten that this is really a federal system. Our government is presumably a federal system, and therefore our political parties are federalized. What this means, then, is that each state has its own rules and regulations. Now, we are extending the normality of these rules a little bit more than we have historically, but essentially it's 50 states. And there are, as you know, no general statutory provisions at the federal level dealing with the presidential nominating process. There are only rules and regulations or statutes that govern the franchise, but not the nominating process itself. So here you're dealing with 50 states, and this is where the complexity of the operation usually throws people, including a large number of our pundits who try to explain this thing as a national phenomenon, when realistically what is happening is something different in each state. Each one of these states has their own rules for the selection of the delegates who are going to make the decision in any one of these nominations. Some of them are more heavily party rules, and some of them are state statutes that provide for the method by which delegates are going to be selected. But they are almost all of them grounded in this particular way. We've had this discussion of reform. The Democrats have tended, as a result of their reform commission this past year, the Democrat convention in 1972 will probably have more mandated national regulations coming from the Democratic National Committee than either party has had previously in terms of the selection of the delegates. The procedures that the Democratic National Committee is trying to operate under, or established to operate under in 1972, requires a larger number of mandated type delegates than either party has had before. Mandated in the sense of a requirement that there be a certain number of specified groups of people serving as delegates to the Democratic National Nominating Convention, i.e. young people, blacks, that there is a proportion or some degree of mandated representation provided for by the rules of the Democratic National Committee. Generally, we have two methods by which we select delegates to the national conventions in this country: the primary and the convention method. Now, as of now, there's been a great deal of discussion and agitation against the convention technique, and therefore we're having a great deal of discussion in regard to whether it's going to be whether more states are going to have primaries or not. As of this moment, to the best of my knowledge, 17 states now are going to have a primary as a method for the selection of delegates to the nominating convention in 1972, although there is under discussion the possibility of another 10 states will have the primary method for selecting delegates to the nominating convention. The remaining states have the convention procedure. They select their delegates on the basis of conventions of one type or another. Again, there is a great deal of confusion as to, even with a primary method, of the states that are now constituted, there are less than 15 of these states in which the delegates selected, being selected by the primary method, that the voter actually votes for a potential presidential nominee. rather than a specific delegate. In other words, anything approximating a binding primary in regard to the nominating process itself, where the names of the presidential candidates are listed on the ballot, and then the people they vote for those. Even in that famous state of New Hampshire, or infamous state, which handles its economy by having the first primary in the nation once every 4 years, and thereby requiring all potential presidential candidates to spend a minimum of $150,000 and up to $1 million in their state for that primary. And it is an excellent program of economic development, which I understand Florida is trying to get in on this year, that the Florida state legislature is considering having their primary the same day as New Hampshire's. New Mexico actually wanted to put theirs ahead of New Hampshire, but they discovered that under their existing statute, if they went any earlier than the New Hampshire primary, they were going to have to establish the filing date in 1971, and they thought that got a little bit tricky in having to file for delegate in 1971 for an election that was going to take place in November, or a convention that was going to take place in June or July of 1972. But even in New Hampshire, there are two ballots, really, in New Hampshire on this question of selecting delegates to the nominating convention. One is the ballot which lists the names of the presidential candidate, which people can mark. The other one which lists the names of the delegates who are going to the convention. And so you have two ballots here, and you can elect delegates who are uncommitted, who are not committed to any presidential candidate, even though the presidential preferential primary may be carried for a particular candidate for the presidential nomination. So the preferential primary, which you hear so much about, is an exceedingly complex thing, and doesn't always achieve the result that those people who are sponsoring the primaries would like to have it achieved. Many states which have primaries today have primaries that merely are primaries for the selection of delegates, individuals who are going to go to a nominating convention, without any indication on the ballot as to who that delegate will vote for if he is elected and goes to the convention. Many states actually prohibit a candidate for delegate position designating who he would vote for on the ballot. He can tell you verbally in the process of his campaign, but he cannot designate on the ballot. Now, in other states, he can. The other technique, of course, of selecting delegates is the convention technique. The convention technique is where delegates, the members of a particular political party, will gather at some level, frequently starting at the so-called precinct level. They select delegates who go to a county convention. The county convention selects delegates that go to a state convention. The state convention selects delegates who go to the national nominating convention. Now, this then is kind of the system by which the delegates are selected. Now, so you have to understand this structure. And only by understanding the structure are you going to be able to win a presidential nomination from the point of view of securing enough delegates. This one aspect which I would like to discuss for a minute or two. Let me give you an example of the importance of understanding the system. In 1964, there was a gentleman, some of you may have read about him, named Mort Frame, who was the former Republican state chairman of the great state of Washington, and who was the chairman for Governor Rockefeller's activities in that state that year. The state of Washington selects its delegates upon the basis of a convention system. First the precinct convention, then the county, and then the state. We defeated Mr. Frame as a delegate from the state of Washington in his own precinct by approximately 57 votes. Now, most of the time, the participation in precinct caucuses is relatively small. Any of you who have engaged in politics will know that. While there were the precincts in Washington are small anyway. By statute, they're limited to 200 people, so that there could be only 100 or so there. But normally there would have been 10 or 15 people there. Mr. Frame counted on his 10 or 15 being there, but there were 57 other people who had a different judgment as to who should be the delegates from that precinct going to the county convention and then to the state convention. So the Rockefeller state chairman in the state of Washington failed to get to be a delegate to the National Nominating Convention on the basis of somewhere around 57 votes in his own precinct. Because once he had lost there, he could never get off the ground again, because he couldn't. That meant he didn't have delegate representation in the county convention, and then he didn't have delegate representation in the state convention. Now, as some of you are going to say 57 people, and I use that deliberately, that does not indicate particularly good involvement. It doesn't indicate that there are large numbers of people concerned and interested. That's true. On the other hand, the state of Minnesota, which also has a convention system for selecting delegates, in 1954 had the largest turnouts that it has ever had in the selection of delegates to a convention at any time. They were having precinct conventions in which there were 400 and 500 people present at those conventions, and the delegates were winning their seats on the basis of 1 or 2 votes, either way. So again, the participation was possible. In regard to the validity of which system is better, a primary system or a convention system in terms of being able to select delegates and secure participation, I think you can make a case for both. The primary system is not the panacea that a lot of people believe it is. Historically, if we can learn anything from the statistics of history, the participation in our primary elections across this land average about 20% of those eligible to participate. This is not because anybody keeps them away from the polls. This is just that they don't go. And I'm not talking about presidential nominating primary. I'm talking about all primaries. Primaries where you select candidates, individuals to be your candidates for mayor, state legislature, Congress, governor, and so on. So on that basis, historical statistic indicates that only about 20% of the people participate in primaries. So the primary is not assured of increasing participation in regard to individuals getting into the electoral process. What it does, I think, assure is it makes it a little bit more open, probably, in terms of allowing people to become candidates for delegate position. Excuse me, because it usually is a little bit better advertised than the precinct conventions or the county conventions, and therefore you're apt to get individuals who will stand for the office of delegate rather than you might where in a precinct caucus frequently you go and there are 5 people there and the precinct's entitled to 5 delegates, and you know who get to be delegates. The 5 people who are there with great unanimity have cast 1 ballot, and all 5 of them become the delegate. I think in terms of the presidential nominating process itself, that probably a mixed system has a value, some primary and some convention type for the selection of the delegates, because it does give you the mix that I think probably results in having better delegates get to the conventions. The second factor, which having now indicated to you that I think the first factor really in terms of how to win a presidential nomination is to understand the system. The second factor that I think is important in terms of winning a presidential nomination is to have a candidate. And this sometimes is easy and sometimes it is difficult. But the candidate and the candidate's activities in the manner in which he is able to project himself obviously provide a very significant force in determining whether you can win a presidential nomination or not. I'm sure you can think and realize that there are many examples of this in the last several years of candidates, both pro and con. On the con side, let's look at George Romney in 1968. George Romney was a candidate for president beginning in 1966, I suspect, but clearly beginning in late 1967, and then establishing a campaign organization, traveling around the country in 1968, and then ultimately withdrawing, not just because of the New Hampshire primary, but because he had not been able to present himself or to get himself presented to establish a relationship with the press which allowed him to be presented to the public in a manner which gave him any prospects of electability. It was just the difficulty that this man had in adjusting to the problem and process of running for president of the United States, which was different from running for governor of Michigan. He just didn't make that transition, and he gets destroyed in this process because of essentially press and media. Because the loss of the primary in New Hampshire is not as disastrous as people would lead you to believe if that were the only event. In the first place, New Hampshire only has 8 delegates, or 8 delegates in the Republican primary. I think they have, 22 on the Democrat primary. This is not a significant number of delegates. I mean, if you're going to win by 8 or 22, you probably better not start, which may be one of the points they're making. What they say, what is important in regard to the New Hampshire primary is they try to use this, and as far as Romney was concerned, his total exposure across the nation, with all of the touring and traveling that he had done, it became clear that he was not going to be able to sell. He just wasn't getting through, and this was a media reaction. On the other side of the coin, of course, and nobody knows for sure, perhaps until Lyndon Johnson has released all of his story, but certainly Gene McCarthy's victory in New Hampshire put him in the posture of being a serious presidential candidate. I'm not sure that anyone, I know Al Lowenstein didn't, and I'm not even sure Gene McCarthy considered that when he went into the New Hampshire primary in 1968, he was doing anything but tilting windmills. He was speaking for a cause, but I don't think he had any serious thoughts that he would ever become the Democratic nominee for president or president of the United States. If he had, it might have terrified him. He overcame that terror later on and did take it to be serious. But I think going into New Hampshire was not the case, but it was built as the case, and whether it would have held or not if Lyndon Johnson had not retired, none of us will ever know. But again, this was the candidate, and the candidate reaction, the press and media reaction to the candidate, which is a significant factor in regard to how you may win or lose a presidential nomination. Obviously, directly related to the candidate and his activities in this area is the candidate's campaign. What kind of a campaign can he mount? Now, in regard to the winning a presidential nomination, this campaign, and you can certainly, the Democrats are giving us excellent case studies of this at the present time. One of the first problems you have usually is money. Not an unusual problem in politics. But right now, we have several presidential candidates on the Democratic side who have had to raise money because they've started their campaigns this early. They are they're opening headquarters, building staffs, and traveling extensively. This means they have to set up an organization, accumulate enough money to be able to pay for that organization and to be able to pay for their travel. This is a factor in getting a campaign for a presidential nomination off the ground. Secondly, of course, is the staff that you're able to recruit. Here again, I think the Democrats this year are looking at a certain amount of difficulty because there are so many of them. They ought to try to work out a pooling system where they could pool their staff, which would save all of them a little bit of money. But they're going to run awful short of staff people if all of them maintain their interest in this race down to through the primaries in the spring of next year, because there are about 15 or 16 of them at this time. A third important factor, and whether it should be or not is a question that we need to debate probably in this country at some length, but clearly it is a factor at this point, and that is the public opinion polls. And I mean the public opinion polls, the Gallup and Harris polls, which are printed in the newspapers, which seem to feel, and perhaps rightfully so, that they managed to maintain their existence on the basis of running trial heats for the presidential election about every 2 months, beginning at the end of the last general election and running up to the next general election. So that if a guy doesn't show up in their polls, he has a handicap in becoming a presidential candidate. And of course, he can fail to show up in their polls in the beginning just because they fail to ask about him. They fail to put his name on the list. If you can get your name on the list, you're almost guaranteed to get 2%. Although I think that's what McGovern, I probably better say 1%. You're guaranteed to get 1% no matter who you are if you can get your name on the list. But these polls, these so-called trial heats, play a very significant role in regard to whether a man may have the capacity of becoming a presidential candidate and therefore a president. They play a very important part in the judgments that other politicians and the public make in regard to that individual's candidacy. And that relates to his ability to recruit staff, his ability to raise money, and his ability to get votes in those states where the delegates are selected upon a primary basis. So this whole question of the public opinion polls. Now, if you're a Nelson Rockefeller, you usually can construct your own poll. You don't have to depend upon Gallup or Harris. You can call, what was his name, Crosley out of retirement, and have him run one for you. But most people have to depend upon the other 2 established pollsters, and in this sense, they can really do a great deal of damage to you. A fourth factor in regard to the campaign, which is related to the 3 I have just mentioned, is the judgments of political leaders. The judgments of political leaders. Now, by political leaders, I mean first the peers. Those men who think they are presidential candidates themselves. If they make a judgment that they can't make it, but you can, that's important. That's important in regard to the campaign because it means whether they'll stay in or get out. Secondly, however, the political leaders, the governors, the senators, those powerful political leaders who are state chairmen, of whom there are some, labor leaders, some of the more powerful labor leaders. The judgment that these men make on the basis of the factors that I have just mentioned to you will have a very significant role in whether an individual is able to win a nomination or not. Yet even though a poll may go up, if their judgment is that guy can't make it or that guy shouldn't make it, then he is going to have a very significant obstacle in terms of trying to secure for himself a presidential nomination. Now, these are the forces then of the system and the campaign itself. The third factor in winning a presidential nomination, of course, is the convention itself. In some instances, of course, conventions are won before the convention opens. If you have a large number of delegates who are committed to a candidate and who are firmly committed to that candidate, when the convention opens, then the convention is won by that candidate and has been won through the delegate selection process. On the other hand, there are conventions which are won at the convention and in the convention city itself. We haven't had too many of these in recent years, but we have had some. In my judgment, Jack Kennedy won the presidential nomination in 1960 in Los Angeles. He won it he did not have a majority of the delegates when he went into Los Angeles, but during the course of the convention and the convention activities, he was able to conduct that campaign in the convention city itself, in the convention hall, in a manner which secured for him a majority of the delegates. In 1952, in my judgment, Taft had more delegates committed to him going into the Chicago Convention than Eisenhower had. Going in at the moment the convention opened, with probably 100 to 125 delegates truly and legitimately and completely uncommitted.
Get to the delegates and communicate to the delegates in the convention city itself. So there can be conventions, there can be occasions in which winning the presidential nomination will occur as a result of the activities in the convention itself. Just a couple of very important, in my judgment, technical things in regard to the convention and the convention city in terms of winning a presidential nomination. One of the most important things is effective communications. Now, this is a tactical situation in a convention city. But if you are trying to secure a presidential nomination for any candidate in a convention situation or in a convention city, it is very important that you have an effective internal communication system of your own. In the first place, rumors are very, very strong in all kinds of politics, but in a convention city, they're just horrendous. There's a new rumor every 5 minutes, and if there isn't, you start one. So you better be sure that you have a communication system that allows you to ferret out fact from fiction. And to keep in touch with your delegates, both on the floor and throughout the convention city itself. And this can, I think, be a critical factor. Delegates today don't really know who they're committed to. I had an interesting experience in 1968. I think they later put this on the air, but in talking to some of the delegates at the 68 Republican Convention who would express to me that they were committed, and I'd say, who you committed to? They'd give a name, perhaps, of a presidential candidate, but I'd say, to whom did you make that commitment? I was trying to discover, whether they had told the presidential candidate that they'd made the commitment to him or to his campaign manager or something else. And I discovered a surprising number of these people who were committed to CBS. Literally, they were committed to CBS because CBS had polled every delegate, and they'd asked them who they were for. And so the delegate had told some little girl on the other end of a phone who said she was from CBS that they were for Nixon. That was the delegate's commitment. It wasn't a commitment to anybody in the political apparatus. It was a commitment to CBS. They had told them they were going to vote in a particular way, and that was the extent of their commitment. But it was a commitment if they believed it. Of course, it's important, and that means that if they feel they're going to honor it. But this problem of communications in a convention situation or in a convention hall, convention city and a convention hall, is an equally important procedure for you to have. Secondly, of course, you better, if you're going into a presidential nominating convention, you better be well aware of the procedures in the convention itself. I have suggested earlier here that you have to understand the system by which the delegates are selected. If you go into a contested convention situation, I think you better know how those convention rules operate. Excuse me, and what those procedures are. Because, roll calls, what can happen at the end of a roll call, recess, all of these things can be critically important to you. As you may know, I think it was in the 1920 or 24 Democratic Convention, one man got up to ask for a recess in behalf of another candidate,
made such a great speech in asking for the recess that they ended up nominating him. So you have to be careful as to how you follow the procedures that exist in the convention hall itself. Looking at the conventions and how to win a nomination in 1972, I'm not going to be foolhardy enough to predict who's going to win any nomination except the Republican nomination, which has an incumbent president, and Richard Nixon will be renominated by that convention if he desires the nomination. The Republican convention in 1972 will pattern itself a good deal like it has historically. It has not changed. Their rules and regulations have not changed that much. Some of the delegate selection process will be changed in a few states. There'll be primaries where there were not before. The size of the delegates and the number of mandated delegates will not change significantly in the Republican convention. The Democratic convention is going to be that great experience in reform, or perhaps I should say experiment in reform. They are going to have 3,012 delegates and 3,012 alternates. One of the problems you run into when you start reforming the system that exists and you want to get more people involved is you add more delegates. They have been overwhelmed with their own generosity in this case. I would hate to be working that convention. I'm very glad I don't have that responsibility, as I have told 2 or 3 men who will be working it, Larry O'Brien and Joe Napolitan and some of the others. I said, I think you are looking at one of the greatest messes you've ever seen in your life. And you thought you had some problems inside the convention hall in Chicago in '68. I'm not counting outside, but inside the convention hall. You wait and see what you got inside the convention hall in 1972. 3,012 delegates, many of whom are mandated, with the Democratic Party leadership that will be presiding over that convention suffering from a great guilt complex of 1968 and therefore feeling deeply remorseful, and that it's tremendously important that everybody be allowed to speak. Unless my admonitions worry them enough so they do something about it, I have predicted that their convention sessions will run from somewhere the first session 8 at night until about 1:30 or 2 in the morning. The second session they'll start a couple of hours earlier, so it'll start at 6 and run until 3 the next morning. And the next session, which would be the nominating session, will start at 4 in the afternoon and run until 5 the next morning. If their pattern, as it now looks like, is going to continue, I really think if the number of candidates that they now have on the horizon maintain themselves, and each one of them goes in with a few delegates, and if the number of delegates they're going to have all feel compelled, as I'm sure they are. There's one great thing. Most delegates do feel compelled to speak. You may not believe this as you watch it sometimes, although maybe you would believe it if you watch it. But this, for many people, is their one day of glory. They have never held any public office before in their life, and they're now participating in this momentous convention, and they're going to have something recorded for posterity. And none of them have yet learned that posterity would be happy if those recordings were short. So this means that when they think of posterity, they think of profound and long, long statements. So I think the conventions of 1972 look in that direction. In conclusion, let me suggest that I've given you really a lecture on these procedures for winning a presidential nomination. Despite all of the press that may have sometimes tried to degrade this process, it is an exciting process. There are tremendous numbers of people that usually do get involved in this process. It goes on, it seems, interminably when you're involved in it, because it does start, as the Democrats are starting now, almost a year in advance of New Hampshire, grinding up and getting ready. And then the media has to follow and report all this with true and complete faithfulness, so that we get this repetitious effort. But you're dealing with the press. It's an exciting process. There is no reason why any of you or all of you cannot engage in it and engage in it at a significant level. There is absolutely no reason why any person in this room cannot have an impact on the selection of a candidate for President of the United States in your own area. You can go in your own area and you can have an impact on the selection of these delegates if you are willing to do the work that's involved. You are not going to achieve it by proclaiming your great knowledge and insight, and therefore saying that you ought to be a delegate. But if you want to work, you can be a delegate. I think, to use an example from a party that I don't belong to, I think what Al Lowenstein did in 1968 proved this as much as anything. Al just went to work. And I'll even say he did tumble a president, although we're never quite sure whether that was the case or not, but certainly he helped in a serious measure. And he did it just by going to work. And he's trying to do it again now. He's stirring up another fuss in Rhode Island this time, which now has a primary. Rhode Island may repeal their primary a year from now. They put one in this year, and Al's going to show them how to make it work. I'm not sure that's what the lawmakers in Rhode Island had in mind, the same thing that Al has in mind. But I bet he will make it work. So you do have an opportunity. You would be amazed at the influence that you can have in terms of the selection of a presidential nominee, particularly in these where there is no incumbent president in a party in which there is no incumbent president. It's an exciting process. It's a lot of fun. Politics is one thing, and I think all people should remember that. We're losing sight of it a great deal today. Politics is people. You deal with people. In most places across this country, it's people that cast ballots. Never mind what the computers and so on say today, it's people. I guess Oklahoma and a couple of wards in Chicago occasionally cast a few more votes than there are people. But generally across this country, it's people that cast the votes. And one of my favorite books in politics, which I would commend to you, is a little book called Plunkett of Tammany Hall. And it's a collection of essays about George Washington Plunkett, who was a real district leader under Tammany Hall. And George Washington Plunkett has all these essays, and I'm not going into all of them for you, although one of the greatest ones is one called Honest and Dishonest Graft. It's a magnificent essay. It concludes with George Washington Plunkett say when they write his epitaph, all they'll be able to put on his tombstone is George Washington Plunkett. He's seen his opportunities and he took them. He has another one, reformers is only morning glories. They look awful good in the morning, but they fade at night. Or reformers come and reformers go, but Tammany Hall goes on forever. Brooklynites are only hayseeds. That's another one of his essays. But he also has one in which he's talking about politics, and he says the key to politics, and I think it's a very sound statement, is the key to politics are people, and the successful politician studies human nature and acts according.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. White. I'm sure that I'm speaking for everyone in the audience when I thank you for being here with us tonight and presenting this very interesting and informative lecture. And I'm sure that you've given everyone in the audience some food for thought. And at this time, it's my pleasure to advise those of you in the audience that Mr. White has very graciously agreed to hold a 10-minute question and answer period at this time to try and answer some of your questions. And this time, I'll turn it back over to Mr. White.
Yeah. I think that Kevin Phillips and Dick Scammon and Ben Wattenberg, who wrote the book The Real Majority. I think all of those gentlemen are right in regard to their facts, and I disagree with all of them in regard to their conclusions. Phillips' conclusion is the emerging Republican majority because Kevin Phillips is a Republican. Dick Scammon's conclusion on the real majority is that it's going to be Democrats because he's a Democrat. I don't know what the emerging majority is going to be. But what both of those books are saying, which I do believe, and which is why politics today for you people should be such an exciting period of time, is we are, in my judgment, we are living in one of those periods of American history in which the fundamental voting behavior of the American electorate is shifting. We don't know why, and I don't think we've ever known why, but it has occurred 3 times previously in our history, very significantly. 1824 to 28, Jackson and his period of dominance. 1854 to 1860, the development of the Republican Party and its dominance. 1932 to 1940, the emergence of the Democratic Party as the majority party that's run this country. I believe we're living in such a period right now in which the fundamental voting behavior patterns of the American people are shifting. I think that's what Kevin Phillips and Ben Wattenberg and Dick Scammon are saying. I'm not as perceptive as they are. I don't know whether it's going to come out Republican or Democrat, or maybe some new word we haven't thought of yet. Yes? Television is obviously a very important medium in campaigning because it's an important medium of communication. My own judgment is that probably in terms of its use, 1970 saw the maximum use of television. I think it will continue to be used and be used quite extensively, but I hope a good deal more effectively. There's lots of politicians and a good deal of campaigning that has yet to learn to use television. And I think you saw a great deal of that in 1970 where people operated on the premise, you know, television is great, get me on television. You can lose on television just as fast as you can win. And just exposure is not the answer, and yet we had a tremendous amount of exposure in 1970, and there were a large number of people who lost, as they frequently are. So, but television is important. The question of media is always a question of mix and a question of campaign. Every campaign's a little bit different, and it depends on what the campaign is and what the mix is. Probably television is the greatest vehicle for identification. If your candidate is not well identified, you can get him identified. That's one thing television does, fast ID. But beyond that, in terms of selling, you need a good composite mix where you use television, radio, print media, organization, the whole bit. It's part of the answer. Well, no. No, I don't think either one of them did, but they were pretty goddamn close to it. They could have lost it. They could have lost it. They didn't really have it. Neither one of them had the majority, had an absolute majority of delegates going in. Neither one. But they certainly had good momentum in most cases. I think really I've been very fortunate. I've worked essentially for candidates that I want to work for, candidates that I believe in. Now, I have worked always for Republican candidates. Now, this probably is my heritage. I grew up as a Republican, and I've always been in the Republican Party, and I have not worked and would not work as of this moment. I can't foresee it for anyone other than a Republican candidate. To take your two specific needles, James Buckley was a registered Republican in the state of New York, and is a part of the Republican caucus, a member of the Republican Senate Campaign Committee, as the junior United States Senator from New York State. The question of the 1964 convention and the 1964 campaign is a rather long one, which I have written a book about. I think that the basis of what happened in 1964 is to be found in Dallas, not in the Republican Party and the Republican convention. I think the assassination of John Kennedy changed the political climate and all of the various aspects that are related to that convention and to that general election. Is a very simple thing, because all campaigns and all elections are reasonably complex.
How do you think the unsuccessful bid of the late Alex Pearson will affect Alex Pearson's third presidential future?
If it affects it at all, I would assume favorably. I don't think there's any negative in it. I think, as a matter of fact, I suspect he's a candidate for the United States Senate largely because of his father's bids for the presidency.
Well, because they were unsuccessful. Do you think that this was...
No. Don't think I have any influence at all.
When a man comes to you asking for your assistance as a political technician for, say, a presidential nomination, what gets you interested in his candidacy?
My position is not fair in this regard, because usually I have gone to the people. I mean, they haven't necessarily come to me. The first presidential campaign, which really wasn't much, shouldn't say that with young people, young Republicans, was 52. I worked for Eisenhower in 1952. I guess because I was a Republican, I was part of the Dewey administration in New York State, and I thought Ike was a great guy. I really, I did. I didn't know him intimately, but I did know him. So I was happy to work for him. I worked for Nixon in '60 because I'd known Nixon ever since he'd gotten into politics. And I did not start out working for him early in the year, but I worked for him beginning in the summer of the year. Goldwater I worked for because, Goldwater ended up working for me. I mean, Goldwater never wanted me to get the presidential nomination for him, which is a little bit unique. He was sorry about that effort, I think, in many ways. So, but now there are people who would fall in the same category that people tend to put me into, of being a campaign technician, a professional campaign manager, who would approach a candidate or try to approach a candidate because they are intrigued with the apparatus and the process, and they like that candidate, think they can get along with him personally, and think he, I would hope, be a good president or something. Yeah.
How much the press affect the outcome of elections? How much do they actually affect?
Well, I think the press has a very significant impact on the outcome of election. I don't know how you can actually measure it per se, but it's clearly a very important part. And I assume by press you mean the full media. I mean, not just the newspaper. That's why every candidate in every campaign spends somewhere around 60 or 75% of their time worrying about it and trying to influence it, both through their paid exposure in the media and their unpaid, the news shows. I got started in politics by running for something myself and got beat and decided never to try it again. I got interested in politics actually off the college campus. I was teaching, and somebody suggested, this was right after World War II, I was considerably younger than I am now, and somebody would suggested that I'd make a fine congressman, and I agreed with him that I'd make an outstanding congressman. And after all, I was teaching political science and government, and I knew all there was to know. So I ran and got beat in a primary, and deserved to get beat but I discovered in that process I didn't know anything about politics. So I decided I'd learn it. And so from there on, I continued to teach for a few more years, and then I went into state government, and then I went into party affairs. Then I started public affairs, so I've been doing it ever since, and I have no desire to run for public office. That doesn't mean that people shouldn't. I encourage lots of people. I encourage everybody to. I just don't want to run. Reagan would have been nominated on the third ballot. Yeah, I'm really, I'm trying to save you time. That's fact. I can prove it. I know. I have the whole delegate counts, and I know exactly where the delegates were and where they would have gone. It might have been on the second ballot after switches, but Nelson Rockefeller had a base of somewhere around 240 to 270 delegates, and he never was going to get any more. The myth that if Nixon didn't get it, that Rockefeller would win was nothing but a myth. Rockefeller could never have touched 700 of those delegates in that convention. Again, I'm sure of that particular fact. I'll take one more. Yeah.
What do you feel about Trump's possibilities as far as nomination?
I think he has I think he's the best dark horse. Obviously, he cannot and should not launch in my judgment, he should not launch a full-scale campaign. He should be, one of the dark horses. I rated him even stronger 6 months ago than I do now because he made one swing. I think that's a mistake. I don't think, he went, I've forgotten when it was, about 6 or 8 weeks ago. He made about a week or so, 10-day tour around, which the press followed and billed as a presidential swing. He ought to space them out. Don't make any swings. He can cover the same amount of territory, but space them out so it doesn't look like a swing. Because the only chance, if he gets to be, if he were to get himself anywhere near the position Muskie's in, if I were Muskie, I'd be trying to get out, except you can't once you get in this position. You're in trouble. But being a front runner at this stage of the game is not the best thing in the world. Because then you got everybody else shooting at you if you're the front runner. Everybody else. And they've got 14 months at least to really get some good shots in. They're watching you. You're the front guy. The press is on your back all the while. Quiet. If I were advising Hughes at this point, but I do think he really could have a very good chance. It's a long ways in advance, but I would rate him the best. He has the best chance of all of the so-called dark horses that are in the race. Okay, thank you.
Well, it's my reluctant duty at this time to bring this meeting to a close. And Mr. White, once again, on behalf of the University Lectures Committee and on behalf of members of the audience, we'd like to extend our sincere thanks to you for making time in your very busy schedule to be here with us tonight and making this very interesting and informative presentation. At this time, I'd like to call your attention to the fact that we have refreshments on the north wall of the room, and we'd like to invite you to stay around afterwards and to have some of these refreshments and to visit with Mr. White. And at that time, he will be happy to discuss with you matters that are of further interest and concern to you. And at this time, on behalf of the University Lectures Committee, I'd like to thank each and every one of you for being here with us tonight and to bid you a very good night.